Chapter 1 of Hans of Iceland by Victor Hugo. Translated by Abby Langdon Alger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. Chapter 1. Did you see it? Did you see it? Did you see it? Oh, did you see it? Who saw it? Who did see it? For mercy's sake, who saw it? Sterne, Tristram Shandy. That's what comes of falling in love, neighbor Niels. Poor Goose Sterson would not be stretched out yonder on that great black slab, like a starfish forgotten by the tide, if she had kept her mind on mending her father's boat and patching his nets. Saint Yusuf the fisher, console our old friend in his affliction. And her lover, added a shrill, tremulous voice. Jill's dead, that fine young man beside her, would not be there now, if instead of making love to Guth, and seeking his luck in those accursed Rorus mines, he had stayed at home, and rocked his little brother's cradle under the smoky crossbeams of his mother's hut. Neighbor Niels, whom the first speaker addressed, interrupted. Your memory is growing old along with yourself, Mother Ollie. Jill never had a brother, and that makes poor widow Stad's grief all the harder to bear, for her home is now left utterly desolate. If she looks up to heaven for consolation, she sees naught but her old roof, where still hangs the cradle of her son, grown to be a tall young man, and dead. Poor mother, replied old Ollie. It was the young man's own fault. Why should he go to Roras to be a miner? I do believe, said Niels, that those infernal mines rob us of a man for every escalin's worth of copper which we get out of them. What do you think, Father Braal? Miners are fools, replied the fisherman. If he would live, the fish should not leave the water. Man should not enter the bowels of the earth. But, asked the young man in the crowd, how if Jill's dad had to work in the mines to win his sweetheart? A man should never risk his life, interrupted Ollie, for affections which are far from being worth a life or filling it. A pretty wedding bed Jill earned for his Guth. So then that young woman, inquired a curious bystander, drowned herself in despair at the death of this young man? Who says so? Loudly exclaimed a soldier, pushing his way through the crowd. That young girl, whom I knew well, was indeed engaged to marry a young miner who was lately crushed by falling rocks in the underground tunnels of Storvardsgrube, near Roras. But she was also the sweetheart of one of my mates, and as she was going to Munkholm secretly, day before yesterday, to celebrate with her lover the death of her betrothed, her boat capsized on a reef, and she was drowned. A confused sound of voices arose. Impossible, master soldier, cried the old women. The young ones were silent. And neighbor Niels maliciously reminded Fisher Braal of his serious statement. That's what comes of falling in love. The soldier was about to lose his temper with his opponents. He had already called them old witches from the cave of Quairogoth, and they were not disposed to bear so grave an insult patiently, when a sharp and imperious voice crying, Silence! Silence, you old fools! Put an end to the dispute. All was still, as when the sudden crow of a cock is heard amid the cackling of the hens. Before relating the rest of the scene, it may be well to describe the spot where it occurred. It was, as the reader has doubtless guessed, one of those gloomy structures which public pity and social forethought devote to unknown corpses, the last asylum of the dead whose lives were usually sad ones, where the careless spectator, the surly or kindly observer gather, and friends often meet tearful relatives whom long and unendurable anxiety has robbed of all but one sad hope. At the period now remote, and in the uncivilized region to which I have carried my reader, there had as yet been no attempt, as in our cities of gold and mud, to make these resting places into ingeniously forbidding or elegantly funereal edifices. Daylight did not fall through tomb-shaped openings into artistically sculptured vaults, upon beds which seem as if the guardian of the place were anxious to leave the dead some of the conveniences of life, and the pillow seems arranged for sleep. If the keeper's door were left ajar, the eye, wearied with gazing upon hideous naked corpses, had not as now the pleasure of resting upon elegant furniture and happy children. Death was there in all its deformity, in all its horror, and there was no attempt to deck its fleshless skeleton with ribbons and gewgaws. The room in which our actor stood was spacious and dark, which made it seem still larger. It was lighted only by a broad, low door opening upon the port of Throndhjem, and a rough hole in the ceiling, through which a dull white light fell, mingled with rain, hail, or snow, according to the weather, upon the corpses lying directly under it. The room was divided by an iron railing, breast high, running across it from side to side. The public entered the outer portion through the low door. In the inner part were 6 long black granite slabs, arranged abreast and parallel to each other. A small side door served to admit the keeper and his assistant to either section, their rooms occupying the rear of the building, close to the water. The miner and his betrothed occupied 2 granite beds. Decomposition had already begun its work upon the young woman's body, showing itself in large blue and purple spots running along her limbs on the line of the blood vessels. Gill's features were stern and set, but his body was so horribly mutilated that it was impossible to judge whether his beauty were really so great as old Ollie declared. It was before these disfigured remains, in the midst of the mute crowd, that the conversation, which we have faithfully interpreted, began. A tall, withered old man, sitting with folded arms and bent head upon a broken stool in the darkest corner of the room, had apparently paid no heed until the moment when he rose suddenly, exclaiming, "Silence! Silence, you old fools!" and seized the soldier by the arm. All were hushed. The soldier turned, and broke into a burst of laughter at the sight of his strange interrupter, whose pale face, thin greasy locks, long fingers, and complete costume of reindeer leather amply justified this mirthful reception. But a clamor arose from the crowd of women, for a moment confounded. "It is the keeper of the Spladgest! That infernal doorkeeper to the dead! That diabolical Spiagudry! That accursed sorcerer!" "Silence, you old fools, silence! If this be the witches' Sabbath, hasten away and find your broomsticks. If you don't, they'll fly off without you. Let this worthy descendant of the god Thor alone." Then Spiagudry, striving to assume a gracious expression, addressed the soldier. "You say, my good fellow, that this wretched woman—" "Old rascal!" muttered Ollie. "Yes, we are all wretched women to him, because our bodies, if they fall into his claws, only bring him 30 escalins reward, while he gets 40 for the paltry carcass of a man." "Silence, old women!" repeated Spiagudry. "In truth, these daughters of the devil are like their kettles. When they wax warm, they must needs sing. Tell me, my valiant king of the sword, your comrade, this goose's lover, will doubtless kill himself in despair at her loss, won't he?" Here burst forth the long repressed storm. "Do you hear the miscreant? The old pagan!" cried 20 shrill, discordant voices. "He would fain see one less man living, for the sake of the 40 escalins that a dead body brings him." "And what if I would?" replied the keeper of the Spladgest. "Doesn't our gracious king and master, Christian V., may Saint Hospitius bless him, declare himself the natural guardian of all miners, so that when they die he may enrich his royal treasury with their paltry leavings?" "You honor the king," answered Fisher Braal, "by comparing the royal treasury to the strong box of your charnel house, and him to yourself, neighbor Spiagudry." "Neighbor, indeed!" said the keeper, shocked by such familiarity. "Your neighbor! Say rather, your host, since it may easily chance some day, my dear boat dweller, that I shall have to lend you one of my 6 stone beds for a week. Besides," he added with a laugh, "if I spoke of that soldier's death, it was merely from a desire to see the perpetuation of the custom of suicide for the sake of those great and tragic passions which ladies are wont to inspire. Well, you tall corpse and keeper of corpses, said the soldier, what are you after with your amiable grimace, which looks so much like the last smile of a man who has been hanged? Capital, my valiant fellow, replied Spiagudry. I always felt that there was more wit beneath the helmet of Constable Thurn, who conquered the devil with his sword and his tongue, than under the mitre of Bishop Isleif, who wrote the history of Iceland, or the square cap of Professor Schönning, who described our cathedral. In that case, if you will take my advice, my old bag of leather, you will give up the revenues of the charnel house, and go and sell yourself to the Viceroy's Museum of Curiosities at Bergen. I swear to you, by Belphegor, that they pay their weight in gold there for rare beasts. But say, what do you want with me? When the bodies brought here are found in the water, we have to give half the reward to the fishermen. I was going to ask you, therefore, illustrious heir to Constable Thurn, if you would persuade your unfortunate comrade not to drown himself, but to choose some other mode of death. It can't matter much to him, and he would not wish to wrong the unhappy Christian who must entertain his corpse, if the loss of Guth should really drive him to that act of despair. You are quite mistaken, my charitable and hospitable friend. My comrade will not have the pleasure of occupying an apartment in your tempting tavern with its 6 beds. Don't you suppose he has already consoled himself with another Valkyria for the death of that girl? He had long been tired of your Guth, by my beard. At these words, the storm, which Spiagudry had for a moment drawn upon his own head, again burst more furiously than ever upon the luckless soldier. What! Miserable scamp! Shrieked the old women. Is that the way you forget us? And yet we love such good-for-nothings. The young girls still kept silence. Some of them even thought, greatly against their will of course, that this graceless fellow was very good-looking. "Oh-ho!" said the soldier. "Has the witches' Sabbath come round again? Beelzebub's punishment is frightful indeed, if he be condemned to hear such choruses once a week." No one can say how this fresh squall would have ended if general attention had not at this moment been utterly absorbed by a noise from without. The uproar increased steadily, and presently a swarm of little ragged boys entered the Spladgest, tumultuously shouting and crowding about a covered bier carried by 2 men. "Where does that come from?" the keeper asked the bearers. "From Urchtal Sands." "Oglypiglap!" shouted Spiagudry. One of the side doors opened, a little man of Lappish race, dressed in leather, entered, and signed to the bearers to follow him. Spiagudry accompanied them, and the door closed before the curious crowd had time to guess, by the length of the body on the bier, whether it were a man or woman. This subject still occupied all their thoughts when Spiagudry and his assistant reappeared in the second compartment, carrying the corpse of a man, which they placed upon one of the granite couches. "It's a long time since I've handled such handsome clothes," said Oglypiglap. Then, shaking his head and standing on tiptoe, he hung above the dead man the elegant uniform of a captain in the army. The corpse's head was disfigured, and his limbs were covered with blood. The keeper sprinkled the body several times from an old broken pail. "By Saint Beelzebub!" cried the soldier, "it is an officer of my regiment. Let me see. Can it be Captain Bollar? From grief at his uncle's death? Bah! He is the heir. Baron Ranmer? He lost his estate at cards yesterday, but he will win it back tomorrow with his adversary's castle. Can it be Captain Lorry, whose dog was drowned? Or Paymaster Stunk, whose wife was unfaithful to him? But really, I don't see why he should blow out his brains for that." The crowd steadily increased. Just at this instant a young man, who was crossing the wharf, seeing the mob of people, dismounted from his horse, handed the bridle to the servant behind him, and entered the Spladgest. He wore a simple travelling dress, was armed with a sword, and wrapped in a large green cloak. A black plume, fastened to his hat by a diamond buckle, fell over his noble face and waved to and fro upon his lofty brow, shaded by chestnut hair. His boots and spurs, soiled with mud, showed that he had come a long distance. As he entered, a short, thick-set man, also wrapped in a cloak and hiding his hands in huge gloves, replied to the soldier. "And who told you that he killed himself? That man no more committed suicide, I'll be bound, than the roof of your cathedral set itself on fire." As the double-edged sword makes two wounds, this phrase gave birth to two answers. "Our cathedral," said Niels, "it is covered with copper now. It was that miserable Hans who set it on fire to make work for the miners, one of whom was his favorite Gill Stead, whom you see lying yonder." "What the devil!" cried the soldier in his turn. "Do you dare tell me, the second musketeer in the Munkholm garrison, that man did not blow out his brains?" "He was murdered," coldly replied the little fellow. "Just listen to the oracle. Go along with you. Your little gray eyes can see no better than your hands do under the big gloves with which you cover them in the middle of the summer." The little man's eyes flashed. "Soldier, pray to your patron saint that these hands may never leave their mark upon your face." "Oh, enough of this!" cried the soldier in a rage. Then, pausing suddenly, he said, "No, there must be no word of a duel before dead men." The little man growled a few words in a foreign tongue, and vanished. A voice cried out, "He was found on Urchtal Sands." "On Urchtal Sands?" said the soldier. "Captain Dispolsen was to land there this morning from Copenhagen." "Captain Dispolsen has not yet reached Munkholm," said another voice. "They say that Hans of Iceland haunts those sands just now," added a fourth. "Then it is possible that this may be the captain," said the soldier, "if Hans was the murderer. For we all know that the Icelander murders in so devilish a fashion that his victims often seem to be suicides." "What sort of man is this Hans?" asked someone. "He is a giant," said one. "He is a dwarf," said another. "Has nobody seen him, then?" put in a voice. "Those who see him for the first time see him for the last time also." "Hush!" said old Ollie. "They say there are but 3 persons who ever exchanged human speech with him: that reprobate of a Spjergodry, Widow Stad, and but he had a sad life and a sad death that poor Gill who lies yonder. Hush!" "Hush!" was repeated on all sides. "Now," suddenly exclaimed the soldier, "I am sure that this is indeed Captain Dispolsen. I recognize the steel chain which our prisoner, old Schumacher, gave him when he went away." The young man with the black plume broke the silence abruptly. "Are you sure it is Captain Dispolsen?" "Sure, by the merits of Saint Beelzebub," said the soldier. The young man left the room hurriedly. "Get me a boat for Munkholm," he said to his servant. "But the general, sir?" "Take the horses to him. I will follow tomorrow. Am I my own master or not? Come, night is falling, and I am in haste. A boat." The servant obeyed, and for some time stood watching his young master as he moved away from the shore. End of chapter 1.